So folks, thanks for coming along tonight, where we have a discussion on After the Voice, two views, and both our speakers have spoken here on many occasions before. Frank Brennan, Jesuit priest, author, but most recently author of Lessons from Our Failure to Build a Constitutional Bridge in the 2023 Referendum, and we have copies of that book here. And I should also say that Frank is a well-known lawyer, and also Damien Freeman, who is an academic, I think we can say, but also a well-known author. Now, we couldn't get copies of Damien's book tonight, but we're taking orders for it, and this is the cover. The End of Settlement, Why the 2023 Referendum Failed, by Damien Freeman. So we've got Frank Brennan's book and orders for Damien's book, and off we go with Frank Brennan, and then we go to Damien Freeman, and then we have questions and discussion. Frank.
Good evening, everyone, and great to be with you. And Gerard and Anne, thank you again for the invitation to address the Sydney Institute. I join with you in acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. And I'm delighted to be speaking with my colleague, Damien Freeman, who did so much for the organisation Uphold and Recognise, seeking to uphold the Constitution and to recognise the first Australians. Today we mark the 57th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, when we overwhelmingly voted yes for Aborigines. But for the first time, the celebration is tempered by the result of another referendum, which went down 40 to 60, and in all states. A week after the disastrous vote last October, the key Indigenous leaders, who'd been members of the government's hand-picked 21-member referendum working group, issued a statement declaring, "It's clear no reform of the Constitution that includes our peoples will ever succeed." This is the bitter lesson from the 14th of October. If they're right, there's nothing more to talk about. The file of constitutional recognition is closed permanently. But they may be wrong, and I hope they are. In his first Boyer lecture in 2022, Noel Pearson fired many imaginations with the call for a constitutional bridge. He spoke of a bridge to join all Australians in common cause, to work together in partnership. A constitutional bridge to create an ongoing dialogue between the First Peoples and Australian governments and parliaments to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal Australia still needs that bridge. The nation still needs that bridge. The nation without that bridge is like Sydney without the Harbour Bridge. That's why I've chosen Grace Cossington-Smith's evocative painting, The Bridge in Curve, for the cover of my new book, Lessons from Our Failure to Build a Constitutional Bridge in the 2023 Referendum. I think it's a wonderful painting that speaks of hope, but also highlights the enormity of the task and leaves us moderns in no doubt that a bridge completed is required for the well-being of everybody. The Albanese government's 21-member working group included a broad cross-section of representatives from First Nations communities across Australia. The faces of the working group, which became most familiar, were Pat Anderson, Megan Davis and Noel Pearson. The proposed constitutional change was first put forward by these three leaders in a belated submission to a parliamentary committee back in November 2018. I think their submission was put in 6 weeks after the closure date for submissions. It was this proposal which was announced at the Garma Festival in July 2022 by Prime Minister Albanese as a conversation starter. The proposal then underwent some tweaking in discussions between government and the 21-member working group. The Aboriginal faces most strongly opposed to the proposal were Lydia Thorpe, who'd stormed out of the Uluru Dialogues, and Warren Mundine and Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, who were not invited in the first place. This was a flawed process. Hand-picked leaders in confidential discussions with government can never deliver constitutional change, no matter what the issue and no matter how much money the corporate sector might commit. Peter Dutton, the leader of the Liberal Party, like his predecessors, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison, when each of them was Prime Minister, never came aboard with support for a constitutional voice. All attempts to move the Liberal Party leadership failed over an 8-year period. Way back in August 2015, the late Michael Gordon, an accurate and on-side journalist at The Age, had reported that Prime Minister Abbott made plain that he does not support Noel Pearson's proposal for an Indigenous advisory body to be enshrined in the Constitution, saying the Parliament could establish such a body if it was deemed necessary. Very important to remember that Gordon wrote that piece having accompanied Abbott on his weekly prime ministerial tour to the north of Australia, and he wrote it from Bamaga on the tip of Cape York. Next day, the ABC's Elizabeth Jackson asked Noel about Gordon's report. Jackson: Abbott says that he won't support your idea of an Indigenous advisory body to be established in the Constitution. What's your reaction to that decision? Pearson: Yeah, I found that very strange, Elizabeth, because only last week we agreed on a process of Indigenous conferences and consultations with Australians, a proper process over 12 months where nothing was to be ruled in and out. And then I find this puzzling commentary from the Prime Minister ruling some models out even before we've started the consultation. Jackson: So you're suggesting that he's told you one thing and told the journalists something else? Pearson: Well, that's the way I read it, and I think Michael Gordon's piece in The Age makes very clear where he, Abbott, stands on the issue. It certainly did, and that remained the stand of 3 Liberal Prime Ministers in a row. Pearson knew this, and Albanese knew this. Abbott had made his position abundantly clear a year and 8 months before the Uluru Dialogues. Turnbull, as Prime Minister, stuck to Abbott's position. Morrison, as Prime Minister, stuck to Abbott's position. Peter Dutton was a Cabinet Minister to all 3. Liberal leaders had ruled out the Pearson option at every turn. In the meantime, the Uluru processes ruled out everything except the Pearson option. The government's process was never designed at getting the Liberal Party led by Peter Dutton on board. As a well-intentioned bystander, I had watched the train wreck coming. 3 months after Mr Albanese made his post-election announcement at the Garma Festival that he would proceed with a referendum, Megan Davis and Pat Anderson spoke at the National Press Club. Megan Davis spoke about the Garma formula and said, "It's not set in stone, but it's a good beginning." So we were all led to believe that it was still a conversation starter. There was room to move, space for compromise, but there wasn't. When asked about Peter Dutton's failure to commit at that stage of the process, Megan said, "That's in some way the job of an opposition, to raise these questions. Questions about detail are perfectly legitimate questions." Davis insisted that the First Nations leaders of the Uluru Dialogues had decided to leave the politics for the politicians. She told the national audience that from their discussions with opposition members, there's strong support from members of the LNP. Like many observers that day, I hoped Megan Davis was right, but I had seen no evidence, and my own limited soundings with the coalition were not good. From my discussions with opposition members, I knew there was considerable disquiet that the Prime Minister had not set up any process for engagement with them. So I wrote to the Prime Minister making 2 suggestions on the 9th of November 2022. 1. Now is the time to set up a parliamentary committee process allowing anyone and everyone to have their say on the proposed words of amendment to place in the Constitution. 2. Now is the time to return to formal bipartisan cooperation between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition so as to maximise the prospect of coalition support for the referendum. The government decided it was not time for any of that. They waited another 5 months before setting up a parliamentary committee. By then, the cement had dried. The words of the proposed amendment were fixed. The formal opposition of both the National and Liberal parties was set, and voters were starting to turn off the idea of a voice. Many voters had no idea about what it was, how it would work, and what it would achieve. There was no constitutional convention or transparent parliamentary process for investigating what was needed in the Constitution and what would attract broad parliamentary support. At one stage, Noel Pearson was happy to emphasise that the constitutional requirement was minimal. He said, "We need a new constitutional hook inserted into the Constitution on which we can hang this structure of the voice." But there was no process for designing that hook, effecting the compromises, and discovering what could be common ground amongst the political parties. The process was a disaster. This was no way to attempt an amendment of the Australian Constitution. 30 years ago, there was a group of us worthy citizens who participated in the Constitutional Centenary Foundation. I was commissioned to write an options paper for the foundation entitled "Securing a Bountiful Place for Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders in a Modern, Free and Tolerant Australia." The paper had to pass the scrutiny of very learned constitutional eyes like Sir Ninian Stephen and Professor Cheryl Saunders. We were a non-partisan group, genuinely seeking a way forward for constitutional recognition. In relation to process, the paper stated uncontroversially and self-evidently, quote, "Constitutional reform is a notoriously difficult enterprise in Australia. Support of all major political parties for any initiative is usually assumed to be a precondition for popular acceptance of a proposal, and even it may be insufficient." When I submitted my draft of the paper with 8 options for constitutional recognition, council members insisted on adding another option, quote, "maintain the status quo," end quote. I was somewhat taken aback. Surely we needed to work for real change. We worked on a formula of words describing this additional option. Presciently we wrote, and I quote, "There may be little to be gained by agitating for constitutional recognition of special rights for Aborigines. Though the majority of Australians in 1967 were prepared to vote at referendum to abolish constitutional provisions which they thought adversely discriminatory against Aborigines, it may be a more difficult task to convince the majority of Australians to vote for special constitutional measures applying only for the benefit of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. Many Australians of goodwill," we wrote, "would prefer a constitution which is blind to the race and culture of its citizens and particular groups." Last year, advocates for constitutional change kept pointing to the many processes which had been put in place, including the Gillard government's expert panel in 2012, the Turnbull government's Referendum Council in 2017, and the Uluru Dialogues, which culminated in the declaration published on May 26, 7 years ago. But these were not processes involving the Australian public. These were not processes aimed at educating the Australian public. The public had been left out in the cold while key Indigenous leaders, handpicked by government, proceeded by way of backroom discussions to propose both the wording and process for constitutional change. That can never work. Megan Davis was right when she spoke here at the Sydney Institute on the 27th of May 2015, the 48th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, and the launch of my book, No Small Change, The Road to Recognition for Indigenous Australia. Davis said, and I quote her, "Frank places the challenge at the feet of Indigenous leaders, whoever they are, at any one point in time. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have sought a respectful, honest and good faith relationship with the dominant culture of mainstream Australia for a long time. We're not there, she said. Debates about the adequacy and completeness of our constitution in today's environment are useful, and they can contribute to a debate not only about Australia's past and present, but about the future of Australia. And importantly, Megan went on to say this: the process is about all of us, but it does call into question the response of non-Indigenous Australians who equally have not been given a chance to participate. It's not enough to leave the burden at Indigenous leaders' feet. Our fates are tied. Neither Indigenous nor non-Indigenous Australians are going anywhere. These are the questions that we must address as a nation of great public policy innovation. I think she was dead right then, and it's dead right 9 years later. If you want to amend the Australian Constitution, you need a process from which no one is excluded, and you face a monumental challenge, whatever the topic of constitutional change. The Australian Constitution is as dull as dishwater. It is a fascinating read only for a subgroup of lawyers and political scientists. Most Australians have no idea what is in the Constitution, but our Constitution can be amended only by an overwhelming vote of the public, a majority of voters nationally and a majority of voters in 4 of the 6 states. You'll never get this unless you've got the leadership of all major political parties on board. So you need a process to get them on board, and you need a process to educate the public about what is proposed. Let's not lose sight of the hope expressed by the Indigenous leaders after they broke their silence after the referendum defeat. They said, "We have faith that the upswelling of support through this referendum has ignited a fire for many to walk with us on our journey towards justice. That journey towards justice will bring us once again to the harbour shoreline where we appreciate the need for a bridge, but it's a bridge which can be constructed only with all parliamentary hands on deck and only with the public's appreciation that this bridge is for the benefit of everyone and not just those who are here first." At Lowitja O'Donoghue's funeral, Pat Anderson recalled Lowitja's achievement with the native title negotiations in 1993. Reflecting on that achievement, Lowitja had said, "We cannot lose the will to resolve these issues because they will not go away. But tackling them half-heartedly or high-handedly will be a recipe for continuing failure. I believe that solutions are at hand," she said, "but they will require determination and patient effort, negotiation and compromise, imagination and true generosity. May Lowitja's vision, hope and realism sustain us all as a new generation commits to completing that constitutional bridge." Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Right on 15 minutes. Terrific. Damien Freeman. Dr. Freeman.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back at the Sydney Institute talking about my forthcoming book, which is going to be released on the 3rd of June, Monday next week, because the first time I spoke here was about my first book, Roddy's Folly, when I talked about Roddy Marr, and in particular I talked about one aspect of that book, and it was an aspect that had received criticism. There were actually 2 aspects of that book that came in for criticism. One was my treatment of Roddy's attitude to the Aborigines, and I was criticised for not having scrutinised that as seriously as I might, and I used my address at the Sydney Institute to reflect on what I'd said there and to revisit that. And that was actually really important for me, because that was the starting point for my thinking about these sorts of issues, about Indigenous affairs and the law, and how someone I'd admired in terms of law and thought as much as anything else had thought about this, and how we might need to start thinking differently and revisiting things. I should say the other aspect of that book that came in for criticism was Roddy's attitude to the Jesuits. In particular, I well remember I quoted his aphorism that Frank Brennan is the archetypal modern Jesuit, short on Greek verbs, long on witchetty grubs. And all I can say, Frank, is would that I had chosen to focus on his rethinking his attitude to the Jesuits rather than the Aborigines. Maybe my whole course of my thinking might have been different, and maybe my contribution to public life in Australia might have been different. There you go. What I want to talk about today is this book that I've written, and I want to explain some of the context for what I did with constitutional recognition and why I think it failed, and what I think the challenges, what it says about the challenges for Australia today. And as most of you will probably remember, if you've been following these things over the last 10 years, although Indigenous people have been talking about these issues for a long time, it really became a mainstream political issue in 2007 when John Howard spoke to the Sydney Institute. It all happens here. And he made a commitment that if he was returned at the next election, he was going to hold a referendum to recognise the Indigenous people in the Constitution. Kevin Rudd then said that he would match that and he'd make the same commitment. And at that point, there was bipartisan commitment that we should recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. And that was really the beginning of all of this. Of course, Howard lost the referendum, Rudd won the referendum. He didn't really deal with that before he lost office. He was, as you'll remember, very preoccupied with the apology, and that was really his main contribution. But when Gillard came in, Julia Gillard, she did push this forward. She made a commitment to hold a referendum, and she appointed an expert panel to advise on this. And the expert panel recommended that constitutional recognition should include a racial non-discrimination clause. And it has to be said, this was not what John Howard had in mind when he talked about recognition. He really had in mind, it's quite clear from this speech that he gave to the Sydney Institute, something much more like a preamble, a symbolic statement that recognised the place of Indigenous people in Australia historically today, something like that. It was much more what he thought it would be about. The expert panel made it clear that that's not what they believed Indigenous people thought this was about, and that Indigenous people believed that this was about some kind of guarantee that the future would be different from the past, that given what had happened in the past, they were looking for some guarantee that things would be done differently, and their proposal was a racial non-discrimination clause. And that it was put out, and it met with criticism from the right. In particular, Greg Craven published a piece in The Australian that was scathing about this, that said it was a one-clause Bill of Rights and it would be opposed by all the Conservatives who'd opposed a Bill of Rights in the past. And this stunned Noel Pearson, who'd been working with the expert panel to make this proposal, and that led him to think that he should go and see Greg Craven, who was then the Vice-Chancellor of Australian Catholic University, and he went to see Greg, and Greg said, you need to speak to Julian Leeser, because Julian was working there. He said, Julian knows all about how to win a referendum, because Julian was for the constitutional monarchy last time round, and Greg had been for the Republic, and he said, you speak to Julian. So that's how Julian got involved, and then Julian said that to them, well, you know, Damien's been working with me on a proposal here, so they brought me in. And that's how we ended up working together on this. And Noel and his advisor, Shireen Morris, said to us, well, they explained what they were trying to do, and we explained why Conservatives would be opposed to this, not because of anything to do with Indigenous affairs, but because of our understanding of the Constitution, the kind of change that we wouldn't countenance. And then they said, well, if you wouldn't accept this, what do you think is the right solution? Because you must admit there's a problem. And I took that seriously, and I thought, well, you're right. If there's a problem, it needs to be solved, and we don't agree with your way of solving it, then we should look for a way of solving it. And that led to what Noel called the Chancellery Group, brainstorming, thinking about possibilities, developing an idea that we believed addressed the range of concerns, the concerns of the Indigenous, the concerns of the constitutional Conservatives, and that ultimately was published by Noel in a quarterly essay and has come to be known as The Voice. And what I really want to say something about in the few minutes I've got left is what I thought we were trying to do 10 years ago and why I think that has become impossible to do now. So the inspiration for what I took it we were trying to do in this group, the Chancellery group, that consisted of Indigenous people, activists and their advisors on the one hand and constitutional conservatives on the other. We took our inspiration, I think, from what I, in my book, call settlement politics, which was the politics that I believe persisted throughout the 20th century in Australia. And you can see this when Alfred Deakin develops a set of policies in the first decade of the Federation, an idea that Sir Keith Hancock in his book Australia, published in 1930, calls the settled policies of the country. And it was this idea that people across political divides could agree on some fundamental policies and that these policies persisted for 80 years. And this included the policy of protectionism and industrial relations policy that continued until the 1980s. Now, there's discussion, there's plenty to be said about why it might not have been a good idea, also about why these policies were good for the country. They did serve some sorts of purposes, even if they weren't good economic policies. But the point at the end of the day was it persisted and they were able to get agreement across political divides about how things needed to be done. And that was the idea, I think, that inspired us, and also the fact, more particularly, that in the 1980s, when these policies were undone and we had the great economic reforms, we moved to a market economy, these great changes in Australian economic life. And this was done, yes, it was done by Bob Hawke as Prime Minister and Paul Keating as Treasurer, but it was also done with the support of John Howard as Shadow Treasurer. And you can see, and I sketched this out in my book, the different paths that they'd been on, the different reasons. They didn't agree about everything. Even in the 80s, as Howard says in his latest book, A Sense of Balance, he says, the historians like to talk about how we all agreed about everything, how wonderful it was. He said, it wasn't as warm and cuddly as all that. And I think he's right, it wasn't as warm and cuddly, but there was a sense in which Howard understood for his own reasons why these changes needed to be made. He didn't stand in the way of it. He had his own way of managing the situation, but there was a sense that although we disagree about things, we can see that something needs to happen and we can find a way forward to do it. And that was what I thought we could do here, what I called settlement politics. And indeed, in my book, I point out this isn't just a distinctively Australian way of trying to find a solution we can all live with, but indeed it goes back further in our political tradition that we get from England, and I think is very much associated with the idea of the Church of England as a settlement. And this really important idea that the Church of England represented, that people could disagree profoundly about doctrine, about ritual, about things that really mattered to them, but they could still somehow be part of a single church, a single community, and the role that ambiguity played in the way that the doctrinal position of the Church of England is set up. And that was really what sort of inspired us, I think, in trying to do this, the belief that we could actually have this sort of common ground approach, and we could find something that people could live with, even though they disagreed about a lot of things. And I think that's what the Chancellery Group was about, and the development of this proposal was an exercise in this sort of settlement politics. And then we needed to have a public conversation, and as Frank says, a lot was done behind closed doors. There was a need to develop ideas and workshop ideas behind closed doors, but there was also a need to have a public conversation. And I don't disagree at all that the public conversation went very badly. The thing I'd add, and that I talk about in my book, is a massive change that I think happened over the 10 years that I was involved with this. And it's captured in the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2023, which measures trust in societies around the world, and particularly in Australia. And it says that in 2023, trust in public institutions was at an all-time low, and polarisation in Australian society was at an all-time high. And I think this is critical to understanding what had happened. And I won't go into that now, but I'll just say one thing about that I found extraordinary. That the data that they had said that Australian people, by and large, would not be prepared to live amongst people who disagreed with them about an important issue, that they wouldn't want to work with people who disagreed with them about an important issue. And most astonishingly said, if someone who disagreed with them was in need of help, they wouldn't want to give them help. It's extraordinary to me to think that Australians could have got to this point and that that's how polarised the country had become. And I think this is really important for understanding what happened over that 10-year period, because I appreciate that we didn't have the right process and we needed a proper process, and that the idea that we workshop with Noel was meant to be a starting point for a conversation. But what I saw happen was this polarisation of society and of politics, and that what we thought was settlement politics gave way to what I would call polarised politics. And I think polarised politics in Australia has come in two forms. I think one form is identity politics. I think the other form is what I'd call populism or populist politics. One is prevalent on the left, the other on the right. But what you saw happen over time is there was just a complete unwillingness to try and engage in this sort of project that I've called settlement politics. And I do actually think, whilst Frank's right that the process was no good, I don't actually think in the end it would have mattered what the process was, because you saw over time it's a complete unwillingness to try and engage with one another, to find common ground. Over time you saw, I think, the advocates becoming more strenuous in the identity politics and saying, well, this is what Indigenous people said they want, so you've got to give it to them. And you see over time the opponents becoming more strenuous in their populist rhetoric about why we shouldn't do this. And there was a complete unwillingness to find common ground. And I wouldn't have anticipated that that was going to happen 10 years ago, that Australia was going to become so polarised. And that I think is really, for me, the big lesson here, and the challenge that we've got to think about as a society, how this referendum showed how polarised we've become, and what we want to do about that. Do we want to be this sort of society? Do we want to have the kind of politics that prevails in this sort of society? And I think Frank's right about the need to find consensus, and you can't have a referendum if you don't have agreement. But I'm inclined to think that if we go down this path of becoming polarised, we should just give up on things like changing the constitution, because it's not the kind of activity that works in that environment. There you go. Very well. I'm just under 15, I think.
I think just by 1 minute, I think. Anyway, if you two both come up here, and I'll move to the side shortly. So a lot of people here tonight, people on Zoom, everyone's got to be brief with their questions and their answers. So I'll start off. Just from both of you, a quick idea. How important was this concept of the voice? Before the referendum, a number of yes advocates said that it was a small, very small change. After it, I don't want to quote any because I'm trying to work out which ones they were, but after it, Stan Grant said no, it would have been monumental. Was it either of those or somewhere in the middle? Just brief responses.
Do you want us to take this off and hold it?
I spent 2 years as a member of the Carmer-Langton Committee. Of 18 people, only 3 of us were non-Indigenous. The constant question I had through that process was, we've had a range of these bodies. Are we talking about something more like ATSIC or something more like the Congress of Australia's First Peoples? If it's ATSIC, there'll be issues to do with resource allocation and corruption. If it's Congress of Australia's First People, it's a talking house, and the question is whether it develops any traction. There was never any clarity that came out of Carmer-Langton as to where on the scale it would be. So it was an idea which awaited fleshing out. And I have considerable sympathy with that. But given the history we've had, NACC, NAC, ATSIC, Congress of Australia's First Peoples, a lot of voters, including a lot of Aboriginal Australians, wanted some clarity about what the hell this body would do, what the shape of it would be, and how it would help to close the gap. And that remained an unanswered question.
So what I take it, what I'm going to respond to is a bit different to what Frank responded to, because what I take it is important, if you say was it significant or not, is was this amendment to the Constitution significant? Was it significant that the Australian people were going to vote for this? And I think the answer to that is yes, it was. Had we have done this, it would have been the Australian people making a firm commitment here that things had to be done differently. This was the basic idea, remember, that the Constitution would be changed to guarantee that in future the Parliament had to hear Indigenous voices before it made laws about Indigenous people. That was the guarantee, and I think that would have been profound. What you have to understand is the difference between how the body was going to operate and the idea that the Australian people had committed to say, actually, we are committed to, given our history, in future things have to be done differently. We have to give Indigenous people a guarantee that if Parliament makes laws about Indigenous affairs, it will hear what they think before they make laws. That was the profound change. And I think over time, Stan is right to say it would have mattered. In 30 years' time, people would appreciate the significance that we had said that. Now, in order to do that, yes, we needed to get the model right. We needed enough clarity that people felt confident to vote for it. But that, I think, was the profound thing that we were doing, is that we were making a commitment as a nation that things had to be done differently in future.
Question here, and then we'll go here.
You've got to read a lot of history to work out whether we're very different now from what we used to be. One of my pet interests is the 1951 referendum. You didn't have a more divided society in 1951 than at the referendum about the Communist Party. Australians were split right down the middle, and it could have gone to yes. So it was never more, we were never more opposed to each other, but we nearly voted yes. So that's the whole explosion of the referendum myth, that we can never get a yes if we've got two sides debating. So what I wonder is it really the loss for the yes case, or the extent of the loss that has so damaged the cause? And I agree with Frank, that extent was because the non-Indigenous Australians were not really consulted. But could you talk about the extent of the loss and the success of the no side? Because I think Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine were standouts with the average Australian.
So we go to Frank first, okay? Frank,
Yes, I think the extent of the loss, that it was lost in every state and by over 60%, and in states like Queensland that it was astronomical. The other thing was that for remote Aboriginal communities, they voted overwhelmingly yes, and therefore the sense of absolute devastation. I've often quoted that I was speaking in Darwin one day in the lead up to the referendum, and an Aboriginal woman at the end of the meeting, with tears in her eyes, said, "Look, a lot of my mob don't understand all this stuff about the law and the politics of constitutional change. I just know if we woke up on the Sunday and it's no, they will feel they've been rejected once again by the people who colonised them and who dispossessed them." And I think that was a very deep vibe about this. And that's why the responsibility upon government was so heavy, to make sure that processes were maximised in order to try and get us to yes. And that's where the explosion came.
Daniel.
Thank you. Damien, the Referendum Council of 2017 only ever said there should be a voice to Parliament, full stop. Not a voice to Parliament and executive government and on all matters, which is what Noel Pearson put forward in 2018 and what we ended up voting on. Do you admit that it was a bridge too far, the expansion, the vast expansion beyond what the Referendum Council ever recommended, which I should also say never said bolt the voice, this entity, to recognition. It said keep them separate. But do you think that it was too far? And have you ever said that to Noel Pearson? And Father Frank, had we legislated the voice first, do you think we could have got there? Thanks.
So we'll start with Damien, go to Frank.
Do I think it was a bridge too far? I think you've got to ask two questions. One is sort of legal or constitutional, the other is political. Now, I think that the amendment that Anne Toomey published in 2015 was a good amendment. I think some version of that could have worked from a constitutional point of view. I think it was more careful than the final amendment. So constitutionally, I think it could have been achieved. But really what your question goes to is the politics of it. And I think there was an unwillingness to acknowledge the politics. And I can tell you I copped a lot of flack when I said to people, we have to read the room, we have to understand, we have to see where the conversation has moved to, and we need to have other options. And indeed, that was the reason Anne Toomey published a second amendment in 2020, 5 years later, that started to try to address things, to say, well, look, there are other ways of doing this. And although she still thought from a legal point of view, her first proposal was a good one, she said, well, look, here are other options. And the point of putting forward other options was to say, we need to have a conversation about options that people can come at politically. And I think there was an unwillingness to deal with that. And there was a belief, I think, by some prominent Indigenous leaders that it was just a matter of them persuading people that they had to accept this position, and that they would be able to persuade people. And I think that was wrong, because I think, yes, we could explain from a legal point of view why this was a safe amendment, and that was the point, that it could satisfy constitutional conservatives. But increasingly it was apparent that politically, what we thought, we all knew we were asking the Australian people to take a step forward. We all knew that they couldn't, it was too much to expect them to take a giant step. We were going to have to ask them to take a baby step. I think the step that was being asked was just too big, and there was an unwillingness to understand that and to see really, there was a choice. You could either, you either waited until the Australian people were ready to take a giant step, and then you had to put this off for a longer time and prepare the country. Or if you wanted to do it straight away, you had to read the room and see what was the step. Like, okay, we can ask them to make a bit bigger step than they feel ready, but only a slightly bigger step, not a huge step more than they're ready to. And that was if you wanted the referendum now, that's what you had to do. And there was an unwillingness to see that although we'd come to a good solution here from a legal point of view, the politics of the country, where everything was at, it did need to be changed. And look, I tried to say that privately, and I can tell you each time I did, yes, it was made very clear to me what some of my colleagues thought of me.
In 1993, I was very privileged to work closely with Lowitja O'Donoghue on the Native Title Act that Paul Keating brought in. Also, she was on the Republic Advisory Committee that he set up, chaired by Malcolm Turnbull. I worked closely with her and ATSIC, where they proposed a preamble for Indigenous recognition. And then in 2015, Lowitja contacted me and said that she wanted me in 2 years' time to deliver the Lowitja oration for the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum. A very profound honour for a white fella. Then came the Uluru Statement, and I had to give the Lowitja oration, I think, about a week or 10 days later. So in that oration, I had to think basically on my feet almost and say, look, I think the only way this will get anywhere is if it is legislated first, because I don't think the Australian public will vote for something sight unseen, particularly given the history we've had with the NAC, with ATSIC and the Congress of Australia's First Peoples. Don't forget, even the Congress of Australia's First Peoples were told they were not eligible to attend the Uluru Dialogues. Now, figure that out. what was the formal voice set up after a major inquiry by Tom Calma was said to be not suitable for engagement in the Uluru Dialogues. That's why I thought something needed to be set up first if there was to be any hope. Would it have got up? I don't know. Given what happened, I think it's all academic. The answer's no.
How much was the hubris of the government driven by opinion polls in 2022, which showed overwhelming support? And could you also comment on the continuing complaints by people in the yes camp about the no camp, when in fact the yes camp said about supporters that one was a bedwetter, another was a crybaby, and a third was advocating that people should be tattooed or have to wear some form of fabric to identify themselves?
Quick responses.
Being a Catholic priest, I'm well past making public moral judgments about others. But I'll make this political point. Imagine you're a Prime Minister and you think, I've been elected, I've been popularly elected, I've said I want to do this, I know the rules about constitutional change, I know my party has made 25 attempts and failed 24 times. I'm going to Gama, I'm going to announce something as a conversation starter. And I'm going to have with me there one Julian Lisa, who was a part of the Chancellery group that came up with this idea, who's the Shadow Attorney General, the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and is a decent fella. Why won't I sit down and have a conversation with him and say, let's try and work out at least a process, if not a formula of words that you think might be saleable to your party? Not a bit of it was done. Hubris of an extraordinary dimension.
No, that's fine.
So, where do we go from here? So just following up the earlier question and some of your comments, if we go back to what's in Anne's book about Menzies and Ebbett, and she's mentioned in a question tonight, that referendum started off with yes at 80% and went down to 49. As Anne said, nearly got there, but it didn't. As I recall, you'd know better than both of you would know better than I do. But I think with the start of polling for the last year's referendum was about 60, and it went down to 39. I mean, what chance does any poll of getting up? Because usually you've got to start up very high to get there, as happened in 67, and it stayed there. But there was no case in 67, as you know.
Well, as Bob Ellicott used to say, you've just got to have the chemistry right. Now, he was the Attorney General in 1977, and he got through 3 of the 8 successful referendums in Australian history. And he used to say to me, the first rule is no legal ambiguity or complexity. Because if there is, all you'll have is retired High Court judges out there arguing with each other. Heard any of that over the last year or two? So that was point 1. Point 2 was to work your butt off getting the parliamentary support. And an extraordinary achievement by Ellicott when you think about it. I mean, November 75, you want to talk about polarisation in Australian society, but there they were by February 77, Whitlam standing up in the Parliament and commending Ellicott for his complete bipartisanship and saying we're on board. So much on board that we, the Australian public, were convinced to vote for a referendum change which was crazy, namely a compulsory retirement age for federal judges of 70. I mean, why didn't we just make it that Parliament can decide? It was set at 70 when you've got all these able-bodied judges who have to find another life for themselves after 70. So change is possible.
Your reflections, David?
Yeah, I think I agree with Frank about that.
Question down the back. Why do you agree with Frank, Damien?
Why?
Tell us.
To your mouth.
But you're the historian here. He's the lawyer.
You're
a philosopher. No? You didn't tell me that.
My question is to sort of look into the future. I mean, obviously, Indigenous people have a view on what this means for them. But I mean, what do you think the process that we've just been through means for Australians more broadly, or the way we think about ourselves? I mean, you've both talked a little about division, but do you think what are its deeper ramifications?
Well, I think there are two. One is, I think there is a broader Australian acceptance that if you're going to make special laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, then they deserve a place at the table, and that they are entitled to the same political agency as anybody else, and that should be unassailable as a proposition. The second is, you know, lawyers love to talk about the Constitution, but basically we've got as far as we have as a federation with the Constitution as it is, and with a High Court which from time to time has been quite creative. Now, in terms of future amendment, should there be a need for amendment, I think we should only contemplate that if there is a burgeoning sense in the Parliament that we think there is a need for a change of substance in order to gain this. The other thing to reflect on in terms of Indigenous recognition in the Constitution is that, yes, in the past, many, myself included, when I wrote the book No Small Change, looking at the history of the 1967 referendum, I remain still of the view that what is termed a minimal symbolic change to the Constitution, which is carried overwhelmingly by the Australian people, is likely to produce substantive change. And we did. We moved nationally from terra nullius to land rights, from assimilation to self-determination. And we did that through the 1967 referendum. And I argued in No Small Change we could do that again if we had symbolic recognition through some sort of acknowledgement in the Constitution, and that we fixed up those race provisions, section 25 and 5126, that could provide a way forward. Now, I remain of that view, but I think it's going to be at least another generation before that can be re-agitated.
If you ask what the significance for the country is, I think the thing that's most significant is that the Prime Minister told us, and everyone basically who since John Howard who thought that we should do this, has said this was going to be a unifying moment for the country. Right? We were going to do this and it was going to be a great unifying moment. Well, it wasn't a unifying moment, and that's the sort of, I think the profound thing about this is, you know, Australians are shown to be seriously divided about these issues, and are shown not really even to be able to have a sort of civilised conversation about the issues. And I think this is the problem. You know, the really profound problem for us going forward is, you know, what would it mean to talk about any kind of unity in the country? I think it's increasingly difficult, as I've said, given what's happening with polarisation in society. It's going to be very hard ever to do the kind of project that was talked about here, to think that you could actually get everyone on the same page.
Father Brennan, on Saturday... Right. Father Brennan, on Saturday in The Australian, you wrote a brilliant piece on the themes that you've been covering tonight. One of the issues that you did raise was a specific thing about unity amongst the Indigenous people. Would you care to comment on that in relation to the referendum and your book?
Thank you, John. Unity amongst Indigenous people is always a great challenge, and we, I think, have to show great trust and respect for Indigenous leaders as they try to navigate that very difficult space, in that any of us who have got any experience, particularly in remoter parts of Australia, know that the constant refrain is, they don't speak for us, and we speak for our country. And unless you're coming here to talk to us, then basically we're not interested in whom you've got there as the self-selected group. That's why I think something like an ATSIC structure in terms of a pyramid of local councils, regional councils and a national council, I think that's the only thing that can have credibility for people who are living particularly in remote communities. And if you don't have that, I mean, it was a courageous attempt by government to say, well, we will hand-pick a group of 21 with whom we will deal. But the moment you had the situation where you had eloquent Indigenous leaders like Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price coming forward and saying, well, we weren't chosen, we weren't consulted, and guess what? We've got our point of view, then it was going to be impossible to sell that to the Australian public.
Final question, excuse me, here from someone in Adelaide, Margaret in Adelaide. You said Frank Brennan made the point that perhaps in 30 years' time something might happen. And she asked, what about the period between? I mean, what about what's happening in some state parliaments? I mean, is anything happening? Well, what are you two going to do for the next 30 years?
Well, I've been involved in the Indigenous rights space, I suppose you might say, for about 40 years. But in recent years, I've only been involved when, well, I've always only been involved when asked, but I've only been involved in substantive things of late where there have been issues to do not just with Indigenous interests, but what I would call the common good or the public interest. So I did with native title, and I did again with this. With native title, I remember one night turning up late to a group of pastoralists in Western New South Wales, and one of the pastoralists very stroppily saying to me, you should just get back to your presbytery and say your prayers. And I said, I'm very grateful for what you've said, sir, and I'll make two observations. One, being a Jesuit priest, I believe in the power of prayer, but I do not think WIC can be solved by prayer alone. And second, there are many people, perhaps yourself included, who entertain the naive view that if we just left it to Aboriginal people, miners and pastoralists, that you'd all be able to work it out and we should butt out because it's none of our affairs. Well, I think it might need some disinterested people who are neither miners nor pastoralists nor Aboriginal who try to be honest brokers in trying to find an answer. Similarly with this, that if you want to amend the Australian Constitution, it's something where you can't just get there with the 3% Indigenous population beating their drum. You've got to get the other 97% on board, and you've got to be able to demonstrate that the proposed law is one which is workable. And yes, in the book you'll see I've now released 5 notes on justiciability, which I circulated to various lawyers, showing that I think there were fundamental problems in terms of the workability of the proposal. So, what am I going to do for the next 30 years? I don't know that I'll be around for another 30. I don't think I'll be involved in Indigenous advocacy space, as I say, unless asked, and unless it is an issue which relates not just to their interests, but to that of the common good and the public interest. Otherwise, you know, I think I've done my dash.
And you, Damien?
I think we've got to remember all of this debate about the voice came out of a debate about constitutional recognition. And that was part of the reason that it was never going to be acceptable to Indigenous people to legislate it first, because they were quite clear that this was about a constitutional guarantee. The concern for constitutional recognition came out of an earlier discussion, an earlier conversation that the country had been having about reconciliation between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. And it was thought that amending the Constitution would make a contribution to that. And we tried, and if we'd succeeded, I think it would have been very meaningful for the process of reconciliation that we'd done that. We failed to do that. I agree with Frank that there's not going to be any looking at the Constitution again anytime soon, but I think the bigger point is people in Australia have to go back to understanding what was going on in this discussion about reconciliation and what it would mean to continue that, because that does need to continue for the sake of the country. It doesn't necessarily, I don't think it's the case that it's impossible to have reconciliation without amending the Constitution. In a different time, it may be that what happens is that there's some other way forward. I'm not saying I think it's a good idea, but there's plenty of discussion about the idea of a treaty. I mean, that's another way perhaps of continuing this discussion about reconciliation. I think the important thing, what's going to happen over the next 30 years, is somehow we have to find a way of continuing the conversation about reconciliation in this country, notwithstanding the vote last year.
Many thanks to our two speakers. As I said, we've got copies of Frank Brennan's book outside. Frank Brennan's lessons from our failure to build a constitutional bridge in the 2023 referendum, and we have an order form and for Damien Freeman's book, The End of Settlement, Why the 2023 Referendum Failed. Now, as you know, at the Sydney Institute, we've had a wide number of debates. We've had both sides talking about the issue in the lead up to the referendum, and this is after the referendum. We've got different views, and that's what we're about. And tonight, both of our speakers have made a great contribution. So thanks to both of you.